And now I get to introduce Dr. Byron. Dr. Byron is in his 13th year as pastor of New Testament here at the seminary. He completed his undergraduate studies at Elam Bible Institute. He has an MA from Regent University and his PhD from the University of Durham in the UK. He is the author of 5 books and more than 25 essays, and he served as a translator for the Common English Bible. He is, in addition to teaching and researching, he has also excavated with students at the Tel Gezer in Israel. I think that's close to how you pronounce it. And he and his wife, Lori, are very active in the university, seminary, and Ashland community. And I also wanted to add, I think Lori would admit this, John wouldn't. They're also very good friends of mine. So, Dr. Byron.
Good evening. Is this on? All right. Well, first of all, thank you everybody for coming. I'm just curious, how many of you, this is the first time that you've been here on the campus? Anybody? All right. Very good. Welcome. How many of you have been here before, perhaps to this lecture? All right. Even better. Great. So we're doing something right. Well, wonderful. I know it's been a long day for some of us. As Dr. Schultz said, we're going through, it's a trustee week, so there's a lot of meetings. And then, of course, we're all mourning the passing of somebody that was actually a very good friend of both the university, the seminary, and the community. So I appreciate you still coming out tonight if you've been involved with that. So welcome. And I also would like to just point out my lovely wife, Lori, of 26 years. Who was up late last night finishing up this lecture for me, so. Being a biblical scholar is a pretty cool gig. I have a great job, and as I tell my friends and colleagues often, I've had bad jobs, and this is not one of them. This is a really good job, and what really makes it so good for me is that I am both blessed and privileged to do for a living that which is my hobby. That is, I get to do reading and studying of the Bible and teaching of it. That which I love to do, it's my job, so I get paid for it. Ask me how, and I'll sign you up. But being a biblical scholar can also be a bit of a conversation killer sometimes. You go to various social events, or like you're on an airplane, you're going, I'm getting ready to travel, say, to Europe or someplace, either for vacation or to speak, and you've got this long 8 to 10 hour flight, and, as everybody's getting settled, you go through the various requirements of small talk, and sooner or later, that question comes up. And what is it that you do for a living? Now, if I'm not feeling particularly shy or overly introverted, I might tell them, but I don't want to completely kill the conversation right away, so I might say, well, I'm a professor. If they're really interested and want to know more, then they'll ask me, and what exactly is it that you do and teach? And I'll say, well, I'm a professor of New Testament. Now, this usually goes one of 3 ways. Usually, I will get the, well, isn't that nice? And they'll turn around, sit down, and they won't talk to me for the rest of the flight, which is all right. Or, for some strange reason, they'll begin confessing all of their sins and explaining to me why it is they don't go to church anymore, even though they know they should. And at some point, I'm trying to get a word edgewise and say, I'm not a priest. But a lot of times what they want to do is they just simply want to ask questions. They have somebody that is there with them, somebody that is an expert in the field, and they've got questions, things that they've always wondered, and they've never always had the opportunity to do it, or they may just simply be afraid to ask these questions. Questions like, well, what is the evidence for the New Testament? How can I actually trust the New Testament? Or, how did we even decide that these 27 books were the ones that should be the ones that we're going to have? And why in the world are there so many different translations out there? Can't we just have one? So these questions exist. Well, where do these questions come from? Well, some of them just arise naturally. Some of them from sitting through church week in and week out. They hear something and something comes to mind. And sometimes they come from the media. On the screen is the cover of Newsweek magazine just a little over a year ago. The Bible, so misunderstood, it's a sin. With a cover like that and a title like that, you know people are going to want to read this. Or at least that's what Newsweek was counting on. And in this article, the author begins, even though he claims he's not doing this, he goes through all the various stages of challenging the veracity of the claims of the New Testament, pointing out various ways in which the Bible contradicts itself, why we cannot actually trust the manuscript evidence for the New Testament at all. And obviously, this cover and this title and even the article itself, 34 pages, by the way, when you print it off of the internet. Okay? Obviously, it is set in such a way in order to attract controversy, which, of course, then will attract better sales. And even making it more controversial is the fact that in spite of what they claim, the cover story being released on January 2nd, it was actually released on December 23rd. 2 days before Christmas of 2014. But what is probably one of the more audacious claims in this article comes along fairly early, in maybe the third or fourth paragraph, where the author says this: "No television preacher has ever read the Bible." Probably. "Neither has any evangelical politician. Neither has the Pope." I suspect Francis would have something to say about that. "Neither have I, neither have you. At best, we've all read a bad translation. A translation of translations of translations of hand-copied copies of copies of copies of copies, and on, hundreds of times." That's a pretty bleak assessment. Basically, what the author of this article is saying to you is that that Bible that you have at home, that you keep on the shelf, or the one that you maybe have with you tonight, or even on your phone as an app, you really can't trust it, because the fact of the matter is we have no idea what the original Bible ever said. All we've got is just really bad copies. How do you answer a claim like that? How do you undermine that? Well, the easiest thing to do, of course, would be to go to the special museum where they keep the original Bible, wheel it out of that vault, right? And just say to them, "Look here, Mr. Newsweek, buddy, here it is." But we have a slight problem here. And that is, we can't do that. And here's why. None of the original manuscripts exist. None of them. As much as I would love to bring to you tonight the original copy of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, it doesn't exist. I wish that we could bring you Mark's gospel, but it no longer exists. The fact is, we live in a time where we could push back 250 years and look at the Declaration of Independence, one of the original copies, a founding document of our nation. I could push back another 250 years and show you the Vatican's original copy of the papal bull that excommunicated Martin Luther from the church. That's for you, my dear. I could push back even another 300 years and show you one of the original copies of the Magna Carta, founding document of democracy. But what I cannot show you is any of the original New Testament. The closest I can get you to the original New Testament is nothing from the first century, but this. What you're looking at is known as the Rylands Papyrus number 52. That is a few lines of the Greek Gospel of John, chapter 18. It dates from about 150 A.D., about 60 to 70 years after John wrote his Gospel. This is not the original Gospel. And it is the closest and the best evidence we have as far as age goes. That's as close as we can get. Nothing more. And how big is this all-important piece of evidence? Anybody want to guess? 2.5 by 3.5 inches, or about the size as the average tea bag. Not very big, is it? So perhaps Newsweek is correct. Maybe the assessment is quite bleak. So what then happened to the New Testament? Well, the first thing you need to understand about the original manuscripts of the New Testament, indeed about any copies of the New Testament for the first 400 years, is that they were written on something called papyrus. Papyrus is a plant that grows along the Nile River that would be split in half, woven together, and they would use it to create a flat surface on which to write, because paper has not yet been invented. And the problem with papyrus is it's organic, which means that it will decay. What's more, because it's a plant material, it tends to attract things like bugs. And so while you may think you're feasting on the Word of God, little insects and worms are doing it long before you. What's more, continued overusage of a book, or as we're going to call it, a codex made of papyrus, leads to serious deterioration. On the screen is Papyrus 66. It dates from 200 AD. You're looking at the first chapter of the Gospel of John. But look at the edges. Look how fragile it is. Just by simply using the Bible, it deteriorates. The early church was not thinking about a group of people sitting in Ashland, Ohio 2,000 years later, and that, you know what, we should make a copy of this and put away the original one in a vault so we have it for later. Instead, they were just using it. And when it began to get to the point where it was no longer usable, they made sure they had a good copy, and they either just used the old one until it disappeared, or they somehow disposed of it. Most of the original manuscripts just simply disappeared naturally. Some of them, we know, however, were intentionally destroyed. In the year 303 AD, the emperor Diocletian put forth an edict commanding all Christians to hand over copies of their scriptures so that they might be burned. This edict was in force for 10 years. We have eyewitness accounts given to us by a friend of ours named Eusebius of Caesarea, the first church historian. And he says this: "We saw with our own eyes the houses of prayer thrown down to the very foundations, and the divine and sacred scriptures committed to the flames in the midst of the marketplaces." Where did the original New Testament go? It was either destroyed or it just simply rotted away on its own. Still, a pretty bleak assessment. So what do we have then? How in the world do we even know what the New Testament said? Do we have anything? Well, actually, we have quite a bit. In just Greek manuscripts alone, we have over 5,700 Greek manuscripts. Some of them dating as early as the 2nd century, that is, within 100 years of when the original New Testament was written. You've seen a picture of one or two this evening. In addition to the Greek manuscripts, we have over 10,000 in Latin. By the time we reach 200 AD, the Greek language is becoming less popular. Latin is on the ascendancy. And by the time we get to about 400 AD, the Bible is being translated into Latin, and that becomes the translation of the Western Church for well over 1,000 years. In addition to these two languages, we also have a variety of manuscripts in other languages like Syriac, Coptic, Slavonic, Armenian, Georgian, and it's not up there, but we could also include Ethiopian. And even in addition just to the manuscript evidence, we have quotes of the Bible in the writings of the early church fathers. People like Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, Augustine. These individuals and others were constantly quoting the Bible in their writings, and when they did so, they often would actually quote large portions of Scripture. It's estimated that there are more than 1 million quotations of the Bible in the writings of the early church fathers. And it's also been suggested that if we had no manuscript evidence whatsoever for the New Testament, we could almost completely reconstruct it just simply based on the quotes we have in the church fathers. All in all, we have about 25,000 pieces of evidence, about 25,000 manuscripts, what one scholar has referred to as an embarrassment of riches. But there's a problem. And you knew there had to be, right? Because otherwise we just end the lecture and go home. And the problem is that in spite of all of this evidence we have, thousands of manuscripts, it's actually quite rare that any two of them actually look exactly alike. There are differences through just about all of them. Lots and lots of differences. What we're going to refer to this evening as variants. How many variants? Anybody want to take a guess? 100, 200, 1,000, 5,000? Depends on who you ask, but the estimates run from anywhere from 200 to 400,000. 200 to 400,000. Or as one skeptical person once put it, there are more variants in the manuscript evidence than there actually are words in the New Testament. Don't worry, I will bring you all back. I can see the nervous look on your face. Okay? So how does this happen? Why are there differences? Where did they come from? Well, anytime you introduce humanity into a process, the potential for error increases greatly. In antiquity, there were no photocopiers. If you wanted something to be copied, say a marriage certificate, a deed, a will, something, you took it to a scribe in the community and that person would copy it down for you. If you wanted 25 or 50 copies of it, you maybe take it to a scribal school where one guy sat at the front of the room, read the document, while 50 people wrote what you just heard. That's how you made multiple copies. And so whenever you have that sort of situation, the potential for error and mistakes to be introduced greatly increases. The fact is, technology back then wasn't what it is now. Okay? Reminds me of a story I once heard about a group of monks working in a monastery someplace in Europe. And they were working on copying this particular passage out of the Bible. And there was this one area where they just couldn't quite figure out exactly how it should be rendered. And they troubled over it and debated over it. And finally, the head translator said, okay, I'm going to go inspect the master copy. So he went and he got the keys from the monastery abbot, opened up the big wooden door, descended down into the bowels of the monastery carrying a candle, looking through the master copy. Upstairs, his friends were waiting to hear what he had to tell them so they could go back, continue on the project, when suddenly they heard this anguished cry coming from the basement. They went over to the top of the stairs. What's the matter? What have you discovered? He says, the word is celebrate. I'm guessing I don't need to explain that. Somebody here doesn't get it yet, but you will at 2 a.m. All right, so we've got differences. What are they? What do they look like? Well, the vast majority of them are actually just simply changes or updates in grammar and spelling. Let me give you some examples. In the area of just spelling, it's not unusual for us to find words or names spelled two different ways in different manuscripts. So for instance, on the screen there, and I know I have some Greek students here, but I won't call you out, but we have my name, John, Ioannis, in Greek. There it is spelled with two news, or well, it's basically the English N, and there it is with one. It's not unusual for it to happen that way. Sometimes, as we all know, spellings change, they improve, and so it might be the case that you have a scribe working with a manuscript that was 100 or 200 or more years old, and when they were copying, they see an older spelling, but they know how the word is spelled in their time, so they simply change the spelling to update it. Sometimes scribes were really lousy spellers. Okay? The idea of spelling being standardized, ladies and gentlemen, is something more recent in history. Only in the 18th century did standardized spelling really become something that was important. A few years ago, I read the diaries of Lewis and Clark as they were writing about their adventures across the West. And as I would read through it, it was not uncommon to run across a word spelled 3 different ways the same time, maybe even in a paragraph. They didn't have the same preoccupation with spelling the way we do. And so if we didn't have that even 200 years ago, we shouldn't expect any different from the ancient Greeks. Sometimes it's something like the inclusion or the omission of the definite article. Because you see, in Greek, it's not uncommon for nouns, all right, proper nouns, to have a definite article on it. And so, the Jesus. And my first year Greek students always get a kick out of this as we are reading through the text and they go, and then the Jesus went up on the mountain to give a sermon. And then the Jesus walked on the water. Now, we don't really know always why they include the article and why they do not. People have made various suggestions, but there's not a whole lot of agreement, and apparently the scribes in it, because sometimes they would include the definite article, sometimes they wouldn't. Even in English today, we make that same decision. None of your Bibles, I'm pretty confident, say, then the Jesus healed the little girl. We simply translate it out because that's not how we speak in English. Sometimes it was a matter of the inversion of a word or a sentence. Word order in Greek is not important like it is in English. Let me give you an example. In English, the sentence, Paul saw Jesus, we know what the subject is because we expect the subject to come before the verb, and we know what the direct object is because we expect it to follow the verb. Change those words around, Jesus saw Paul, and we have a very different sentence. Mix it up a little bit more, saw Paul Jesus, we don't know what's going on, right? In Greek, that doesn't matter. Because in Greek, all of the nouns take particular endings that tell you which noun is the subject, which one is the direct object. So even though the scribe doesn't copy down the words in the same order, people reading it know where to begin and know where to end. So the meaning of the sentence doesn't change no matter where you put the words in the sentence. Another challenge the scribes ran into was something called scriptio continua. And this is a style of writing in antiquity because prior to the 8th century, there were no spaces between words. There was no punctuation. And so when you read a sentence, you have to figure out where the sentence begins, where it ends. You have to figure out where the word begins and where the word ends. If you're a scribe coming along after the invention of spaces and punctuation, this means you need to make a decision about where you're going to divide words and where you're going to begin and end sentences. And this can be a bit of a challenge. So for instance, let's just take an example of this in English. What do you see up there? Right. You either saw abundance on the table, right? Or you saw abundance on the table. I spent an inordinate amount of time looking for a piece of dancing bread. There's more research into dancing bread. I watched more old Wonder Bread commercials. Sometimes a scribe would actually fill in gaps. This happens quite often when we've got a story that maybe shows up in 2 or 3 Gospels, and there might be some slight differences, and the scribe is aware of it and tries to harmonize it. So for instance, in Matthew chapter 6, we have the Lord's Prayer. A prayer that all of you are very familiar with, the prayer that has been said in churches for probably close to 2,000 years. But what a lot of people don't always appreciate is there are 2 versions of this prayer in the New Testament. There's also one in Luke chapter 6, which is more of the Reader's Digest version. Unlike in Matthew, Luke doesn't say our Father in heaven, he just simply says Father. He says your kingdom, but there is no your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The giving of the bread is similar, although slightly different. The forgiveness is similar, but slightly different. But both say lead us not into temptation, but Luke does not include the but deliver us from the evil one. I won't do a pop quiz and see how many of you have ever noticed this. But check your Bibles, it's true. A scribe copying the Gospel of Luke, however, either thinking, because he knows the Matthew version so well, either from reading Matthew or reciting it every day in church, either on purpose or just out of rote memory, begins writing out the prayer in Luke, but then fills in the gaps. And we have manuscripts where Luke has a prayer of the Lord's Prayer that fits very closely to what we have in Matthew. Sometimes a scribe simply wants to make a clarification. I know it's in Greek. Hang on. In this sentence, John 3:16. Look, there's no sacred cows tonight. I know I've touched the Lord's Prayer. Why not you, John 3:16, right? All right? For thus God loved the world so that he gave the one and only Son. Not his Son. It only says the one and only, in spite of how you've memorized this and read it. But because that might be seen as a little ambiguous, some ancient scribes, as well as probably most of your modern translations, now say his Son in order to clarify it. And some scribes made changes because of theology. Theology that when they read something did not seem to agree with what they thought they knew or what they believed. So for instance, in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, verse 32, Jesus says, "But the day and the hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, only the Father." But the scribe who's copying this, a few of them looked at this and they said, but wait a minute. If Jesus is God, doesn't mean that he's all-knowing and that he should know. And so they didn't have any problem with simply leaving that out. Now, one of the greatest challenges for a scribe in antiquity was differentiating between letters that looked similar. This is not unlike when you go to the eye doctor. You go in there because you can't see, at least not very well. And the first thing they do is they say, please take off your glasses or remove your contacts. And then they sit you in a chair all the way on the other side of the room. They turn off all the lights, and then they project an eye chart over here. And they say, would you please read the bottom line? Now, you are there because you can't see. But they're asking you to read this anyway. And you're like, you want me to read the bottom line? Yes, please read the bottom line. But there's 4 lines. I can see them clearly. And I don't know why they make eye charts with all those lines above, because nobody ever reads them. They immediately go to the, and you're sitting and go, made in China. And the doctor's standing behind you laughing, okay? Those charts do nothing. They're just there to make fun of you. Well, in Greek, when you're working in a particular maybe dark room, or in the age before corrective lenses, or perhaps somebody who worked before you was rather sloppy, letters can be confused. So for instance, the epsilon, the theta, the omicron, and the final sigma. All of those in the right setting can be confusing. The pi, the gamma, the iota, or the tau. Or how about the alpha, the lambda, or the delta? And so some of our variants are simply a matter of just one letter. Let me give you 2 examples this evening. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verse 42, the scribes have to deal with a word, and they have to figure out what it said. Is the word karpas or karphos? If it's karphos, you can hear it, it's log. If it's karpas, it's fruit. The spelling, even if you don't know Greek, you can see on the screen that everything is similar except for the thing that I have conveniently put in red for you. Okay? And depending upon what word you choose, changes the words of Jesus just a little bit. Did Jesus say, first take the log out of your eye? Or did he say, first take the fruit out of your eye? I suppose either one is important to know, but I don't think bananas are what Jesus had in mind. Another one comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the so-called love poem. I told you there are no sacred cows, right? Lord's Prayer, John 3:6. Let's do this. Well, in 1 Corinthians, we have to make a decision. Did Paul say there, if I hand over my body that it might be burned? Kau thesomai? Or did he say, if I hand over my body that I might boast? Kau kesomai. Listen to the difference. Kau thesomai, kau kesomai. If there's somebody sitting at the front of the room speaking that, you can easily confuse that. Or if you're moving along quickly and you're actually saying out loud what you read, all right, kau kes, and you say it and you change just how you spell it, the word can change. If you know this verse from the King James Bible, then you know that it says there, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. But if you're reading a more recent translation, like the New International Version or others, it now actually says, if I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Some people here are going, that's what happened, because you learned it this way. Incidentally, the NIV, knowing that people know this one so much, have actually expanded it a little bit to include hardship, because they want to include that because they know people are so used to that reading. We could go on for a long time tonight. I could just introduce all kinds of these examples, which may or may not be interesting to you. They are to me. But what's more important, though, is when we begin looking, you see the kinds of examples we're dealing with when we talk about differences or variance in the manuscript evidence. But when we talk about that, okay, so where do we stand then? Well, the fact is 95% or more of the variants are nothing more than just simply updates, spelling changes, or scribal errors that make complete nonsense out of the text, that it's obvious to us immediately that the scribe has done something in error and we know what the correct reading is. Less than 1% of all the variants are actually of such weight that we really need to give them really careful consideration. In fact, out of all of them, whether you go with the 200 or the 400,000 number, only 2 are longer than 2 verses. And you know them well already. Mark chapter 16, verses 9 to 20, the so-called longer ending of Mark. And in the Gospel of John, chapter 7, verse 53 to 8 to 11, the story of the woman caught in adultery. Both of which in your Bibles are clearly marked out, footnoted, and bracketed with the notes. These do not appear in our earliest, most reliable manuscripts. So we're not hiding anything from you. If we say we've got 25,000 manuscripts and we've got all these variants, well, how does this actually fall out then? Well, if we go with the maximum number of 400,000, that means you're looking at about 16 per manuscript. That suddenly reduces it down quite a bit. If it's the lower number of 200,000, you're only looking at 8. But even here, the numbers can be deceiving, because it makes it sound like they just simply went through and liberally shook out, right, variants all over. But actually, all of them tend to, or most of them I should say, tend to congregate onto particular passages over and over again, areas that we've always known were difficult to translate and to interpret. So when we run across them, we're not surprised. What's even more important, though, for our understanding tonight, I want you to know that these things do exist, so when you hear about them in the news and in the media, you can say, okay, yeah, this is the truth. But you've seen examples of what the majority of them are like, and most important for us is this. Essential Christian beliefs and practices are not impacted. There is no significant doctrine of the New Testament hangs on a variant. The truth of the resurrection or the claims about the resurrection of Jesus and the means of salvation and everything else does not hang on a variant text. And anybody who tells you otherwise is selling you something, because the evidence is out there for all of us to see. And there are a lot of people that work on this. So while there are differences, yes, they're there. We acknowledge them. And I've introduced you to just a very small number of them. They don't impact the claims that the Bible makes. But before I close off this section, I want to just give you a little bit of a comparison. How does the New Testament stack up against other historical documents? If we take just the 5,700 Greek manuscripts, some of them dating as early as the 2nd century, and then we compare it to, say, the Gospel of Thomas, which we hear quite a bit about on television shows, and it's talked about. We've even talked about it in this forum here in the past. What's the evidence for that? Well, not a whole lot, actually. We have 3 fragmentary Greek pieces from the 3rd century and only 1 complete manuscript, and it's in Coptic and Egyptian language. That's it. Not that the Gospel of Thomas is not an important historical document for us to study and understand, but the evidence for its use and understanding in antiquity is still not as great as what we have for the New Testament. Plato, who lived about 350 BC, we don't get our first manuscript for him until 1,200 years after his death. Yet nobody questions if Plato existed. Well, some people do, but... How about Homer, author of the Iliad and the Odyssey? Well, we're standing on somewhat better ground here. We have 2,500 manuscripts. But yet, at the same time, that's only half of what we have in the New Testament. Herodotus, early Greek historian, 25. And probably one of the most surprising, 1st century Roman historian, Tacitus, 3. So all in all, we really do have an embarrassment of riches. Yes, there are differences at times between the manuscripts, but you can be confident that the New Testaments that you have and that you know so well, that you have the best possible New Testament that we can give you. That we have done the absolute best job possible to reconstruct what we believe the original looked like, and we're all pretty confident that we're pretty darn close. That leads to the second question then. If the manuscript evidence is so good, who decided what books were the ones that we're going to read? That person on the flight would finally say to me, I heard that the Emperor Constantine and a bunch of bishops got together at the Council of Nicaea, and they decided what books would go in and what books would not. It's a conspiracy theory. Now, this conspiracy theory or this idea has several sources where you may learn about it. History Channel, programs like Bible Secrets Revealed. Should be removed, I was going to say that, but maybe it should be. Where the announcer comes on and says, this program is about the Bible, which has been debated and argued over by scholars for thousands of years. At which point I'm like, and? And then most of the people who are on the program, I don't know. All right? I mean, I work in this field, and I'm like, I don't know who these people are. Okay? But sometimes there are people in the field who should know better. And they still make similar claims. As in the case of this book, Constantine's Bible, Politics, and the Making of the New Testament. Probably the greatest source, though, in the last decade, at least on a popular level, has come from Dan Brown's book and movie, The Da Vinci Code. Starring Tom Hanks with that hair as Robert Langdon. All right, and in the book, Robert Langdon and Sophie, they've traveled to the home of a British professor who's living in France. This guy, Teabing, who later on I believe became Gandalf or what's the other guy? Harry Potter fame, yeah. And they go there, and I want to go to a passage of the book where Teabing is explaining to Sophie about how we got our Bibles. And he says on page 313, he says, more than 80 Gospels were considered for the New Testament, and yet only a relatively few were chosen for inclusion. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John among them. Who chose which Gospels to include? Sophie asked. I'm not doing a female voice, I'm sorry. Aha! T-Bing burst in with enthusiasm. The fundamental iron of Christianity. The Bible as we know it today was collated by the pagan Roman Empire, Emperor Constantine the Great. A few pages later, on 317, T-Bing continues, Constantine commissioned and financed a new Bible which omitted those Gospels that spoke of Christ's human traits and embellished those Gospels that made him godlike. The earlier Gospels were outlawed, gathered up, and burned. It's a pretty bold claim. Well, was there a conspiracy? Well, since we can't be here all night, the simple answer to the question is no. In spite of what has been claimed by Dan Brown and others, no council has ever imposed a canon on the church. The Council of Nicaea did not deal with what books were going to be in the New Testament. They were discussing who was Jesus and aspects of the Trinity, not what goes in and what does not go in the New Testament. In fact, if there ever was a process in church history, a specific process where they sat down and said, this is how we're going to decide what goes in and what does not, and they're going to take a vote, if that process ever happened, we have no trace of it whatsoever in history. They didn't leave us any record of it. Instead, what historians and biblical scholars commonly agree on, unless you're on the History Channel, of course, is that what the church did was not to create a canon, but instead they acknowledged and affirmed that which was already a reality. That these books were those that were already in common usage, that these were the ones that were being used most often in the context of study and worship. And by the time the church got around to actually saying what is, if you will, a list of books, a canon, they already knew what they were. Let me show you what was really an evolutionary process rather than a democratic process or a conspiracy. We know that the early Christians were both writers and collectors of books. Paul's letter to the Colossians, he says to them, once you finish reading this letter, go over and pass it on to the church at Laodicea 5 miles down the road and get the letter I wrote to them and read that. We learn two things here. First of all, the early Christians not only preserved the books that were written by the apostles, they sometimes passed them around with one another. We also know that Paul apparently wrote a letter to the Laodiceans that we no longer have. What happened to that letter? We don't know. Why didn't they save it? Well, we would assume then that unlike Colossians and other letters that Paul wrote, this book for some reason was never seen to be useful in the area of study and worship, and eventually it just fell out of use naturally. We know also that the early church were collectors of the sayings of Jesus. So in 1 Timothy, we have a combination of a quote from the book of Deuteronomy with what the words of Jesus that show up later in the Gospel of Luke. Before they had a written gospel, they were collecting the sayings of Jesus orally. And from 2 Peter, we have a rather famous statement made by the author there about how Paul wrote all of these letters and that he was aware of them. And then, of course, this one, his letters contain some things that are hard to understand. And all the biblical scholars said, amen. I have a list of things, and someday I'm going to meet the Apostle Paul. And we're going to have a long talk about what in the world did you mean here? And I have a feeling that I'm going to be waiting in line because I have a feeling there's a few people ahead of me. By the time we get to the 2nd century, we know from witnesses of early church fathers like Justin Martyr that the reading of the Gospels took place as part of a common event on Sunday worship. And Irenaeus, also in the same century, used the compass points, north, south, east, and west, in order to defend that there should be no more and no less than 4 Gospels. And he even compared these Gospels to the 4 living creatures in Revelation chapter 4. Not the strongest and the most logical argument, I will admit. However, what it does help us, though, is gives us a snapshot in history that the early church already was aware of what the four Gospels were and that they weren't willing to open them up to any more. But we don't need to just simply look at quotes and allusions in writings. We have artifacts. We have actual manuscripts. What you're looking there is P46, and it contains many of the Apostle Paul's letters. You're going to notice that Hebrews is there because a lot of people in antiquity would attribute the letter to the Hebrews to Paul. Most New Testament scholars today would not. But it contains Romans, Hebrews, Galatians, all. It's missing 7 pages. We estimate by the writing style and the number of pages that it's missing 2 Thessalonians and Philemon. But we also have in P45 the Gospels and another manuscript, the book of Revelation. A couple of things to point out. First of all, the New Testament wasn't being bound together all in one. They were being Gospels and Acts, Paul's letters, and then maybe other books. They weren't just one book. And then again, here's another great example of overusage. This crumbles and disappears. The fact is, the early church did not feel the need to sit down and write out a list of what books you will read as authoritative. The earliest list that we have comes to us in the 2nd century, but it does not come to us from a bishop of the church. It comes from the church's earliest and probably most famous heretic, Marcion of Sinope. Marcion, who traveled to Rome in 140 A.D., was teaching that there were 2 gods. There is the mean, old, nasty God of the Old Testament, and then there was the loving and the merciful God of the New Testament. And Marcion was the first person that we are aware of that actually drew up a so-called canon, or a list, if you will. And in that list, he has 10 of Paul's epistles and the Gospel of Luke. Now, while this is certainly not all of the New Testament that we have now, what it is for us, however, is evidence of what books were well known in those days and what were considered to be authoritative, even if Marcion was considered to be a heretic. And in fact, we have lots of people writing against him saying, no, you've done wrong, you've chosen too few. How did the church respond to people like Marcion? Well, they didn't just set about and say, all right, you wrote a list, now we're going to write a list. That's not what the first impetus was. Instead of coming up with a canon of books, they came up with a canon of faith, what we call the regula fidei, or the rule of faith. And in that rule of faith, what they focused on was not what books are in and what books are out, but who is Jesus? And what is it that he has done for us? They focused on the identity of God and Christ and what God was doing through Christ. And it ended up in a statement that we now commonly agree was produced sometime around 200 AD, known as the Apostles' Creed. A statement that has been recited in churches for close to 2,000 years. I've always found it interesting that the early church creeds never found the need to talk about what the Bible was and how we understood it. Instead, they focused on who Jesus was and what God was doing through Jesus. The earliest list that we actually have from history doesn't show up until 323 AD from our good friend Eusebius, the church historian again. And there, he's not intending to create a canon. He's actually recording what already is commonly agreed upon. And Eusebius says, there are some books that we all agree upon. In fact, there are 22 of them. The Gospels, Acts, Paul's epistles, including Hebrews, 1 John, 1 Peter, and you'll notice a question mark next to Revelation, because when you read Eusebius' comment, he says something like this, and I suppose if you need to, we can include Revelation. Okay? And there's a few of us, in spite of last year's lecture, who will most agree with him. But Eusebius, because you'll notice we've only got 22 books there, Eusebius talks about how the fact that, these are the ones that we all commonly agree upon, but he acknowledges that even in 323, there were some disputes. And these are the ones that were disputed. James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2 John, and 3 John. Even Martin Luther wasn't sure he liked James so much. Notice, though, what's missing again. None of the other books that you're hearing about. Okay? They're not being included in lists, Gospel of Thomas and others. The fact is, it's not until the 4th century that list making of books of the New Testament really begins in earnest. It starts with Eusebius and the list I just showed you. And then it comes to us not in a list, but actually in an artifact, something known as Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest, most complete Bible in the world, which contains all 27 books of the New Testament. In 367, the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, writes a letter to the churches, and he talks about the 27 books. Not as these are the only ones, but here are the ones that are seen to be as trustworthy and authoritative. And then by the end of the 4th century, Council of Carthage also does this, and Augustine is there. So, suddenly in the 4th century, it's almost like we have an explosion, if you will, of list making. Why? Why would they suddenly now feel the need to make lists? Well, one reason is probably the persecution of Diocletian. When you're being commanded that you must hand over scriptures to be burned, it means then you've got to make a decision what is sacred and what is not. In other words, what am I willing to hand over and what am I not willing to hand over? Also, in 331, Constantine the Great requests of Eusebius that 50 Bibles be made for the churches in Constantinople and abroad. Now keep in mind, Christianity for the first time is a legal religion. The emperor is not trying to destroy the Bible, he wants Bibles. So this is a new opportunity for Christians. And so to make a complete Bible leads to the question, what do you include and what don't you? And something that may seem a little bit more mundane, but is a good explanation as well, is technology. Because prior to the 4th century, the ability to bind all the books together between 2 covers didn't exist. You didn't have 66 books between 2 covers until the 4th century. No evidence for it. So once you start deciding that you're going to bind together books, then the decision is which ones do we include. The development of the New Testament canon began early on when early Christians began collecting books, trading them, and preserving them. We can see the evidence from early on that the books that we now already know and are familiar with in the New Testament were there. Those were the ones that the church used for the most part. Did other books come in and out? Yes, they did at times, and that's another lecture. However, we know that the New Testament, that this was a stable set of books that were used. So then, what about then translation? Because after I've explained to this individual sitting next to me about manuscript evidence, about how Constantine really didn't conspire against you, and I'm trying to get ready because we're getting ready to land, and I think I'm going to get maybe just a few moments of shut-eye, the person goes, one more question. Why are there so many translations? Good question. I go to the store, I decide I want to buy a Bible, either for myself or for somebody else, but when I get to the store, I have no idea which one I should buy because there are so many different English translations. So why are there so many translations? Well, and why do we keep translating the Bible? You heard this evening, for instance, I was a translator with the Common English Bible. Why do we keep doing this? Well, one reason that we continue to translate the Bible, and will continue to translate the Bible, is because the English language changes. If you look at the 1611 King James Bible and compare it to now, there are at least, if not more, than 500 words that no longer are being used or they mean something completely different today. Let me give you a good example. In the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, it's not uncommon to read about how the armies of Israel go in, defeat their enemies, and carry off all this treasure with them back to their camp. And the Bible in the King James says, and they carried off the booty with them. Right. You read that in a youth group today. And you're going to get exactly what you all are doing right now. Because you know darn well 16-year-olds have got a completely different thing in mind when they think booty. You're thinking treasure, and they're going, oh yeah, treasure. Okay? So we change to update the language. We also have a lot more and better manuscript evidence. When the King James Bible was translated, they had 6 Greek manuscripts for the New Testament. 6. And they didn't date any later than the 10th century. In other words, they were only 600 years older. Now, of course, we have more than 5,700 just in Greek, and they go back as far as the 2nd century. And then, of course, there are just different translation approaches. We don't try to translate the New Testament, or the Old Testament for that matter, in a very wooden way, literal way, which, of course, is impossible anyway. If you have any skill with a second language, you know that that's impossible. There is no such thing as just simply connecting the dots from one language to another. And so the intent in modern translations is to help you to understand your Bible in the best way that you can. Now, I could talk a lot about translation strategy tonight and what the NRSV does and the NIV does, but rather than do that, I'd rather send you home with a different approach to thinking about translation, and that is translation as actually Christian heritage. Because translation has been with us since day one. We know, for instance, that Jesus spoke Aramaic. There are times in the Gospel of Mark where the author takes an Aramaic saying and translates it for his readers. But here's the problem. He's not doing it in English, folks. He's doing it into Greek. Which means then that although Jesus spoke Aramaic and maybe Hebrew, we didn't actually end up with Jesus' Aramaic words in the first Gospels. We ended up with his words in Greek. What's more, when the authors of the New Testament are quoting the Old Testament, they're not using the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, they're using a Greek translation of the Old Testament, because that was what was more popular and was better understood by people. In the first 5 centuries, translations proliferated in a variety of languages: Syriac, Coptic, Ethiopian, Latin, all these different languages. Many languages that we're not even talking about today, and I suspect some you're hearing for the first time this evening. The fact is, early Christianity, the concern was to make the Bible available as widely as possible so that it could be read and understood by the people who were becoming Christians. And this is one thing that is somewhat distinctive about Christianity from other religions. For instance, in Judaism, even though they have translations, they continue to put emphasis on Hebrew for the purposes of study and worship. Great example. Yesterday on campus, we had a rabbi from a Messianic synagogue and chapel. He closed the service by chanting Hebrew. Go visit a synagogue, and they will still use Hebrew in a great part of the service. In Islam, although they also have translations, they prefer that you read the Quran in Arabic, and you will not receive the full blessings of the Quran unless it is read in Arabic. How many of you here are glad that you don't have to take Greek? Okay, I know we're going to sign you all up for my class next fall. You did take Greek. I know, you're wonderful. She's my Greek assistant. So when Luther, Wycliffe, Tyndale, and others were translating the Bible into the language of the common people, in spite of the controversy that the church was giving them difficulties over the fact that they weren't using Latin, in reality, all they were doing was getting back to the early roots of Christianity, its heritage. And that is, they were getting back to making the Bible as widely available as possible. In the 21st century, yes, we have got a lot of translations. In the 1950s, it was estimated that there were about 100 translations in English alone. Nowadays, it's probably closer to 200. Most of them you will never hear of. but I think you already saw some of the ones that I already showed you just on the earlier screen, ones that you are familiar with. The fact is, however, is that most translations today all work from a commonly agreed upon set of Hebrew and Greek manuscripts. When I began my translation project for the Common English Bible, I was using the Greek manuscripts that we all agree on. So we all start from the same point. We just might put it or translate slightly different for the purposes of communication. But whatever translation you choose, you can be confident that the translator has your best interest in mind. It is not their desire to trick you, to deceive you, to try and lead you away from the faith, because the same interest you have is theirs. They want to be able to read and understand the Bible to the best of their ability. So where does that leave us this evening? Well, I want to close off this evening with a quote. The quote comes from Otto von Bismarck, the first chancellor of modern Germany. Already I can see you going, where is this going? Right? Well, and Bismarck is supposed to have said, the less people know about how their sausage and laws are made, the better they sleep at night. And the same might be said about the Bible. Because just as you want to be able to eat that bratwurst or that Polish kielbasa and enjoy it and not worry about what's on the ingredient list, you're probably wishing now you could go home and read your Bible and had never come to this lecture this evening. Okay? But the fact is, even though the process of how we got the New Testament might actually appear to be messy to us, the way it came about, the fact is you can be confident that you have the best New Testament possible. And that the selection of the books was not made by a group of people trying to act against your interests, but they were merely confirming and acknowledging what the church had for the most part already come to agree upon, that these were the books that were useful for purposes of study and worship. And that the translations that you have represent, yes, they're different, yes, it can be confusing, but they also represent a part of what is really good about Christianity. The importance of making the Word of God available as widely as possible. It can be somewhat disappointing to learn how we got our New Testaments, or any of our Bible for that matter. We have ideas about how we think it came, or we have ideas about how we think it should have come to us. And when you hear and you learn about these things, it can be somewhat disturbing, and you're like, well, didn't God just drop it out of the sky for us? No. But yet, while we can affirm that the Bible is inspired, we also acknowledge that it is covered with human fingerprints. And while that may not be what we want the New Testament to be, or at least how it came to us, we're better off probably acknowledging that that is the way that it did come to us, and rather saying how God should have done it, we should be able to sit back and acknowledge how it happened, and you know, God seemed to have been okay with that. What is important for us to remember, of course, is that the Bible is not the focus of our faith. So often it's easy for us to think that that is where our faith is placed, because the Bible tells us about Jesus, it tells us about God, and the fact of the matter is the Bible is not the focus of our faith. The Bible informs our faith, but instead points us to the living Word, which is actually Jesus. Thank you. We'll take a few questions, if you like. Yes, sir.
Dr.
Dennis.
Byron, if I remember correctly, you said that Jesus spoke in Aramaic,
Mm-hmm.
and that Muslims today read the Quran in Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, for us lay people, what's
Aramaic is, they actually are all connected. They are what we refer to as Semitic languages, okay? But Aramaic is a form of, let me put it this way. It's related to Hebrew. It uses Hebrew letters, but it is a language that actually was picked up while Jews were living in Assyria and Syria in that area, okay? And so it came over from the Arameans, okay? And it became the most popular language after the Assyrians and the Babylonians and other people had been conquering the areas. So that was the language they spoke. There is some discussion about whether Jesus actually spoke Hebrew or Hebrew as well. Hebrew was not being used to a great degree in the first century because it had been overtaken by Aramaic, but we do have a lot of evidence for Hebrew in the first century. I'm also not above thinking Jesus probably also knew some Greek. He was probably trilingual, okay, because those were the great languages, but predominantly Aramaic.
is it spoken today?
It is actually. There is a church known as the Assyrian Church, which unfortunately is under significant pressure right now from ISIS. And many of them are fleeing that area as well as Iraq. The Assyrian Church exists to this day, and Lori and I once had the privilege of attending a wedding at a church in Bethlehem, and the entire ceremony was in Aramaic. I understood none of it. I've taken Aramaic, but I can read it, not speak it. Another question. In the way back there.
What is the significance then of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Good question. The Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, what's the significance of them, among many things, is that the Dead Sea Scrolls contain a copy, either completely or a fragment, of every book of the Old Testament with the exception of Esther. And what was significant about it is prior to 1946, our best copies of the Old Testament, the manuscripts, only went back 1,000 years. Now, that's a long time when we're talking about you and I. But when you're talking about stories that are thousands of years old, that's not that long. So with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we literally pushed back our manuscript evidence 1,200 years in one day. Okay? Now, there are other books that are there because it was a community that was writing, and those books tend to be not unique to them, but specific to them. But we also know that we have all of those fragments or complete Isaiah scroll, for instance. And so it's very important for us for manuscript evidence. In fact, your New Testament today, even though it's still based on other manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls are consulted, so for instance, to improve aspects of Isaiah and things like that. We understand better because of that. Other questions? Yeah? Oh, Jill. Yes, is that Jan? Ella? Q. Okay, wow. I have a whole lecture on this. Q is this character on Star Trek. No. Q comes from the German word Quelle, which means source. And what that is when we're looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay? And New Testament scholars, I would say a majority of them, 99.9% of them, all agree that Matthew and Luke started writing their Gospels by copying Mark and then expanding it. I think it's like 95% of Mark, word for word at points, is repeated, literally, in Matthew and Luke. But there's other material that Mark doesn't have, like the Lord's Prayer. Doesn't show up in Mark, but it's in Luke and it's in Matthew. So when we have information, sayings of Jesus, all right, particularly, this is all about sayings. When we have sayings of Jesus that show up in both Matthew and Luke, we refer to that as Q. In other words, it's a way for us to identify there was another source for Matthew and Luke's information. Now, Jan, was there a document called Q? I doubt it. I mean, there was probably something, but I'm skeptical whether there was something. They didn't call it Q. In fact, and I'm not alone in this, I don't object to even saying that there were maybe even more sources that Matthew and Luke were using that agreed, but calling it Q is just a convenient way to say, this is the information that Matthew and Luke agree upon that is not in Mark. I will say there are some New Testament scholars who don't believe in Q. So, in spite of what you may hear in the media, I mean, they're a minority, but there are some people who don't believe that it ever existed, and they've got other theories. And this is why we get jobs and keep publishing, because we keep making this stuff up. Okay? Any other questions? Yes, Rob?
Is there any manuscripts of parts of the New Testament that were written originally in Aramaic?
There are some statements, not about Aramaic, but in the early church fathers, we hear some statements about a Hebrew version of Matthew. Okay? We hear about it a number of times. And there are even quotations that we're told come from that. Tertullian and others do this. But the problem is this. One, our Gospel of Matthew certainly did not come from a Hebrew version. We can determine when we look at a gospel whether or not it was translated from Hebrew or not. There's just clues you can pick up on. Okay? I read an interesting book recently. I could talk to you about it later, but there's some stuff in Luke, his sources, where somebody suggested maybe that's the Hebrew background. But we don't have any. The Ebionites, an early Jewish Christian group, they apparently had some Hebrew Gospels, they said. We have no evidence whatsoever. Doesn't mean they didn't exist. We just don't have the evidence for the obvious reasons I said to you tonight. Greek, though, obviously was the most popular. Yes?
What would be your short airplane answer to someone who would the contention to say the earliest manuscripts was 80, 90 years after the original gospel reported that was written? Would that be enough time to pervert the story and to create a new gospel, making Jesus live the deity where he was?
Yeah, that comes up quite a bit. All right, so let's say the Rylands fragment or P66. These things show up 150 to 200 years, 80 to 150 years later. Couldn't somebody have changed all of this? Yeah, they could have, but here's the thing. We have not one scrap of evidence that this ever happened. And we've got the quotations, some from people like Clement and other people. I remember having a class, so I'm hopefully bringing up names for you here that you remember, who are quoting these scriptures. We know, for instance, that they knew Philippians and Corinth, they knew these letters. One thing I didn't say tonight, but quite often the conspiracy theories are a lot more exciting than the truth. Okay? Yes? And then he drops the mic and walks away. That's an excellent. What about the Apocrypha? Well, what I didn't tell you this evening, but you asked, and it's okay, is that in Codex Sinaiticus, remember I told you the world's oldest, most complete Bible? It includes the Apocrypha, folks. We know that there were people that were familiar with these books. The early church fathers, they talk about them. It's interesting, though, that they often are said that they are seen as to be useful in that, but they're never listed as canonical. Interestingly enough, the 1611 King James Bible had the Apocrypha in it. They've only been removed in the 19th century. Because they were shipping Bibles overseas and no Protestants were reading them anyway, so it was cheaper to print them without it. What I also didn't mention is that when I was translating for the Common English Bible, I was translating a book from the Apocrypha, the Book of Judith, because I didn't think we needed another translation, but I think Protestants should read the Apocrypha. I don't consider it to be scripture, but I do consider it to have useful information and things that could be inspiring to us. Russell, I saw your hand, so I suspect you're going to answer her much better than I could.
Well, the Geneva Bible does not have the Apocrypha.
True.
Being the Geneva Bible, which incidentally had a much more ancient manuscript base than the King James did.
Yep. Much better.
What you said was basically the revival in Wales. It was a financial decision.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the original legislation for the King James Bible, tenders were colonized, but they did not include the Apocrypha.
Russell actually writes my lectures, so he's supposed to do this quietly, not. No, actually, he's a wealth of information. Thank you.